good morning to everybody. I first would to express several thanks. I would like to thank very much to the organizers of the Congress, and in particular to Philippe Rimbaud and to Wanda Capella, who supported the idea of this plenary session and helped me in its preparation a lot. I also would like to explicitly thank to Jacques Comay for the extremely stimulating exchanges we had in the preparing of both plenary sessions, having the idea that there were tight connections between the two topics. I mainly have to thank to the colleagues who accepted to participate in this session, Susan Silbe, Martin SHAPIRO, and Antonio CASIMIRO FERREIRA. I have to thank them especially also because they accepted the efforts, the work required for such a participation, even if we were not, as a learned society, as academic institutions, in condition to offer the best possible conditions. Many, many thanks for being here. And last but not least, many thanks to you for being here in this early hour and this third hot, heavy day of Congress work. Indeed, it should be obvious that what we want to discuss this morning requires to be discussed in a much broader circle than only the four people who are at the panel. We have to involve other perspectives, other experiences, other national experiences, and this is why we have some time for a more open debate, actually 4 times of debate over this morning, to which you are invited to participate. Now to the topic, to make it as short as possible, the reasoning is the following. We had at several occasions in our sessions up to now the opportunity to get back to this issue. We know it all. Politics are experiencing huge transformations these years related to transnationalization of politics, to globalizations, related to new combinations, new balances between public and private actors in the political field, related to the use of and to the development of information technologies, related to the fact that there are new domains of social activity emerging in which private and public actors try to get some initiative and control. So there are changes in politics, and these changes do have effects on our business, and this in 2 ways. On the one hand, as jurists, lawyers, as scientists, we are challenged to participate in the procedures, in the measures that make out politics nowadays. But at the same time, we are hit by these policies. We are object of these policies. So we have several reasons to pay attention to them. But there is one particularly important reason for us to pay attention to these transformations, and this is because they do impact on the conditions of democracy. Democracy does not work the same way under these new political conditions as it did for some time at least. And this partly because decisions are taken at a scale where there is no kind of structured civil society, public debate, ethnos, so that there is no social counterpart to the political organization. This is due to the complexity and opacity of many political procedures. This is due to the gap between lay knowledge and expert knowledge. There are several reasons that make that politics are not, democracy does not work the same way under these new political conditions. And if this is the case, this regards in particular law and science, science and law, and here I could come back to a reference made at the opening session of this Congress by Vittorio Olgiati. He reminded us that we are celebrating 500 years of Il Principe of Machiavelli, and Machiavelli developed the thought crucial for what became modern politics in the context of Firenze, Rinascimento, Firenze, of Renaissance Florence, where law and science had acquired new features and did create actually the conditions for new forms of politics. And now that these forms of politics are changing again, we have to question our role in these changes. This is a challenge to us. We have, coming back to the title, to think about what could be politics of science, politics of law in this context. We speak a lot about politics of science, politics of law in these last years. The problem is it is not exactly what is required to think properly the role of scientists and jurists in politics. It is, to a large extent, a discussion just responding policies of science or of law that are challenging us in our institutions, in our laboratory, in our personal work, to participate in the implementation of these policies. And reflection on politics of science and politics of law should be broader than just its response to public policies in that field. This is the reflection this debate would like to foster, to encourage, and the one idea that gave us momentum in the organization of this debate is that this discussion, reflection of what have lawyers, what have scientists to do in politics meets particularly favorable conditions in sociology of law, because here we meet each other. We have scientists reflecting their position in the new political processes, meeting jurists, experiencing their position in the new political processes, and vice versa. And this creates, it seems to me, favorable conditions to think over our role as specialists of the knowledge, of modern knowledge, in the current political transformations. And this is what I'm very happy to be in condition now to discuss with my colleagues here. Susan Silbe has worked extensively on law, science, organizations, relationship between expert wisdom, expert practices, and everyday practices, common sense. So, as a matter of fact, the whole problematic I want to tackle is in her work, even if the terminologies obviously cannot be the same, but could now be possibly combined. Martin Shapiro is an outstanding specialist of judicial politics, also a very lucid and skeptical observer of what, in particular, jurists are in condition to contribute to politics in our modern world. So his contribution to this discussion is of obvious relevance, and the combination of both, and the fact that both are here accepted to attend a meeting in the domain, as Latour would not accept me to say, of sociology of law, could be an illustration of that potentiality we have to take advantage of, sociology of law being a place where so complementary experiences are in condition to meet. And Antonio CASIMIRO FERREIRA accepted to participate, which is for me excellent, because what he brings in the discussion is the experience both of a specialist of a legal domain and of a researcher in social sciences, of acute versions of the new policies currently transforming our politics in the moment when southern peripheral Europe is suffering the consequences of the crisis. So here we have one more opportunity, this time in the extreme conditions where, again, sociology of law, and it is not by chance that you are challenged by the public discussion in Portugal, is at the cutting edge of what happens. To get in the substance of the discussion, I wanted to start it.
It may help you to know that although I'm a professor of law, I am a political scientist. I teach conventional law courses in administrative and constitutional law in American law schools and European law faculties. And I also teach interdisciplinary law and society style courses to graduate students and undergraduate students, both in the United States and in Europe. I've taught at Sciences Po in Paris, but not in Toulouse. And of course, I can't teach in France at all any longer because I'm too old. I'm going to talk about big apples and little apples in my talk today. And what I hope to do is, at a very concrete, mundane level, talk about one example of how socio-legal research might inform public policy debates in areas of law that are of particular interest to politicians and to the political process, namely criminal justice. I'll start with a theory, which is that in formulating most legal doctrines, we really begin by imagining a prototypical or typical or normal situation Then we imagined various alternative rules that we might adopt and involve ourselves in mental experiments as how each of those rules would work in the prototypic situation we have imagined. In the area of criminal due process, of what kind of judgment process is due to those accused of crime, I believe we began with the prototypic situation of the small apple, of the individual criminal with very limited resources who committed relatively small crimes and did them relatively frequently. The grocery, in the United States, we would say the 7-Eleven robber, the robber of small grocery stores, of small shops. That small resource criminal does not have the capacity to commit big crimes, and just as importantly, he does not have the capacity to prevent himself from being caught, and he does not have the capacity to prevent himself from being successfully prosecuted. He has low resources, and the state has high resources. And we formulate our rules of criminal justice on the basis of that notion of the state with high resources and the criminal with low resources. Thus, we say we can only convict if we can show that the accused is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, putting all the burden of proof upon the state. We provide the accused with lawyers. We go by the motto, it is better to allow 10 guilty people to go free than to find one innocent person guilty. And we do so in the full confidence that he'll rob the first grocery store and get away with it, and the second one, and the third one, and the fourth one. But by about the sixth one, the dumb guy will get caught and end up going off to prison. And so the criminal justice system works. Now, what I wish to do is introduce a second paradigm. And here, you see here I'm basing myself in socio-legal studies and examining not the doctrines of the law itself, but the way we go about formulating legal doctrines from a social perspective. What I wish to introduce is the high-resource criminal. The criminal who acts not alone, but as part of a large organization, who has large resources to commit crimes. He has not a pistol, but a series of machine guns or bombs. He commits his crimes within an organization which itself has power. He has, therefore, high capacity to commit large crimes and high capacity to hide those crimes and high capacity to resist successful conviction, even if he is caught. Our difficulty is we do not have a model of criminal due process that will fit that criminal. Our model fits the paradigm of the small criminal. It does not fit the paradigm of the big criminal. And what I wish to do is examine the notion of inventing a new set of criminal due process rules run against the paradigm of the large criminal as opposed to the small one. Who are the large criminals I have in mind? Organized crime, the mafia and such is one. Drug dealers, that's an overlapping category, is another. The great drug merchants or cartels. Youth street gangs, which in many countries control whole neighborhoods to the extent that no member of the gang can be successfully prosecuted because the gang threatens everybody in the neighborhood, so no one will appear as witnesses against them. Terrorists, and finally, to get back to Susan's point, corporate executives who meet all of the characteristics of the paradigmatic large criminal. By the way, while in general Americans may think of fraud as different than crime, lawyers think of fraud as simply one category of crime. So these fellows are committing crimes as far as lawyers are concerned. But the lawyers have failed to make this distinction between small criminals and large criminals. They use the criminal justice procedural rules on corporate executives that they would use on the grocery store robber, and therefore they prove the system proves itself incapable of dealing with the corporate executive who is a criminal. Now, what I wish to argue is that the criminal justice system in the United States and in other parts of the world has begun to sense this problem, and it has invented all sorts of ad hoc, unself-conscious, separate devices which are treated as exceptions to due process, to deal with these large criminals. And I just want to run through a few examples of that. With the mafia, we have for long accepted very, very high levels of surveillance and subversive infiltration into the mafia. And we've accepted those. They are now much in controversy in dealing with terrorists. But it is the notion that the mafia, since they're not a small criminal, cannot be dealt with by the normal criminal law devices, but instead have to be infiltrated and spies put within them and their telephones tapped and so on. Again, terrorism, the same thing. We're saying the same thing. The terrorist is not a small criminal. He's a criminal of a different sort. And we can't say of the terrorist, well, he can do the first bomb and he won't get caught. He can do the second bomb, he won't get caught. He can do the third bomb and he won't get caught. We'll eventually catch him on the 10th bomb. We're not willing to wait for the 10th bomb as we're willing to wait for the 10th robbery of a liquor store. For street gangs, in the United States, we now have gang injunctions in which a court places a whole neighborhood under a legal order that prevents more than 2 young people from gathering on a street corner and prevents all of them from wearing certain colored clothes, the so-called gang colors. We wouldn't tolerate such a limitation on other citizens. We do it on the gang, on the gang members because they're committing lots of crimes and we simply can't convict them of them because we can't get witnesses to testify against them. For corporate criminals, there is a particularly interesting set of devices at work in the United States. In Europe, generally speaking, corporate offenses are treated as crimes and prosecuted as crimes. In the United States, regulatory law, the law that governs the conduct of corporations, is sometimes enforced by criminal law, but often by civil law instead. But on the criminal side, what is typical in the American situation is that the Justice Department or some other criminal prosecutor files criminal charges against executives of the corporation. But there is not a trial. Instead, the prosecutors meet with the representatives of the corporation, and they arrive at a settlement. The settlement, which is an official order by a court, says the following. The corporation says, we never did it, and we promise not to do it again. And then it says, and we agree to pay a large fine for something we didn't do. But we are punishing a corporation with a large monetary penalty without any trial, let alone without a conviction. It's the most fundamental violation of due process in the normal sense that you can think of. With drug dealers in the United States and a number of European countries, any property used in the transportation or sale of an illegal drug may be seized by the state. A house, an apartment building, a boat, an airplane, if it's been used to transport drugs, may be seized by the state with a court order, but seized without anyone being convicted of any crime. The guy driving the boat who gets caught and is tried for drug possession may be found not guilty of drug possession, but the boat remains in the hands of the government. So we're taking property without due process of law in the conventional sense of due process. In other words, the legal system is today responding to the large criminal, the criminal of high resources, by carving out a series of exceptions to the standard rules of due process of law in criminal justice. That's a very bad situation because the exceptions threaten to swallow up the rule. If you keep making more and more exceptions to your general rule, you weaken your general rule. I would prefer a different solution drawn again from the socio-legal distinction between small criminals and large criminals. I would like there to be 2 distinct, separate criminal due process systems. One, our conventional one, the one we've had for the small criminal. But I propose we invent and legislate, enact into law, a new set of due process procedural rules for handling the large criminal, that we do so self-consciously, and we label what we're doing as either small crime due process or big crime due process, so that we stop eroding the due process we afford to normal small criminals, and yet arrive at a criminal justice system that can cope with the big criminal. Now let me state clearly what I have not said to you. I have not said to you that there should be no due process for large criminals. What I've said to you is we should start over again, using the large criminal as a separate paradigm, invent a separate and new due process of law to handle the large criminal. A due process of law that takes into account that with the small criminal, the government has large resources and the criminal has small resources. With the big criminal, with the corporate criminal or the mafia, it's the criminal that has the larger resources that the government has. And that should lead to a rebalancing of due process in terms of public security versus individual liberty. And that if we, and I am not prescribing what those new rules of due process should be. What I'm saying is I'm proposing a program that we now begin to build up a new set of due process doctrines that are explicitly designed to deal with the problem of the large resource criminal. Thank you.
Bonjour. Pour moi, c'est un honneur et un plaisir d'être ici dans cette session plénière du Congrès. Honneur parce que je partage la parole avec beaucoup de collègues, mais honneur aussi parce que parmi nous avons collègues qui sont très importants pour moi, et je suis sûr que pour votre collègue portugaise. Et je me réfère à professeur Jacques Comaille et professeur André-Jean Arnaud. Plaisir aussi, parce que dans ce congrès, nous réavivons les mémoires ainsi que les futurs de la sociologie du droit, dans sa diversité paradigmatique et théorique, mais aussi des diversités des expériences et des situations que nous rencontrons dans le monde et à chaque pays. Dear colleagues, good morning. I would like to thank the invitation to be here and share some ideas with you. I would like to establish that in relation to the previous interventions, we have no apples examples, but probably problems about how we can take apples. The idea is that we face a moment of exception in many European countries. Not exception related to law and order issues, but exception applied to social and labor rights. The rollback of the welfare state, and I regret to say this, the exception of democratic principles became the social, political, and legal pattern we face in what we could name the austerity society. But it is austerity society a brand new form of social and political arrangements? There exist really differences, for instance, with concepts like risk society, liquid modernity, reflexive modernity, exclusion society, etc. Probably austerity society running to some theoretic problems. Probably became necessary to do more meta-theoretical work in the meantime, austerity society offers us an overarching perspective about the volcano and the spectre, to use Tocqueville and Marx's well-known expressions we live nowadays. Of course, in the theorizing process, we need to fix some guidelines of the austerity society. And I would like to suggest that in addition to the obvious financial and economic aspects, there is also a social model of reality and a certain type of law and policies. Let's move forward. And let me begin with a brief definition of austerity. In the current economic context, the concept defines a set of economic and social policy options which aim to put in action restriction on state budgets and transform the redistributive policy. Beyond this, exists a strong economic rhetoric based on the following ideas. First, it is necessary to reform the state in order to slim it down. Second, it is necessary to restrain the irresponsible behavior of citizens. And thirdly, it is necessary to provide the financial market, which are the means of financing the economy, which confidence they need. Let me share with you a short story. Imagine Bill Gates walking into a bar. Not at this time of the morning, of course. Once he enters, everyone in the bar is a millionaire because the average worth of everyone is pushed way up. This is Marx Blitz's example about the economic blindness on the issues of redistribution in the austerity model. This is statistically true, but empirically false. In reality, there are no millionaires in the bar, just one billionaire and a bunch of other folks who are each earned a few thousands of euros or less. So, austerity policies and, of course, law suffer from the same statistical and distributional delusion because the effects of austerity are felt differently across the income distributions. This is quite obvious for sociology. We live in unequal societies, and some of us rely more on state services instead of others. In addition, what currently expresses the sociological specificity of the concept of austerity is the blurry nexus between financial markets and individuals. So, I underline the idea that austerity arises as the pattern that connects systemic and mainly financial problems to questions involving individuals, families, and organizations in the face of a policy of civil request. In this analysis, I will take into account two presuppositions. First, austerity society and this neoliberal economical rhetoric claims for a new generation of politics and rights. Second, this new generation of normativity blend with forms of sociability, for example, punishment, guilt, fear, sacrifice. In result, a new pattern of social legal practices emerged simultaneously by the split of social and juridical expectations and also by the questioning of basic principles of the rule of law, such as the non-retrospective, retrospective of rights, and the principles of legal trust and confidence. Let me give only two examples about this. First, the subversion of the theory of the separation of powers by the way of the power of the unelected the power of the Troika, IMF, European Central Bank, European Commission, each impose a deeply reform on state and laws in some countries. Secondly, the principle of selectivity in the application of exceptional measures. For instance, the Portuguese example reveals the state doesn't want to renegotiate or terminate public-private partnership contracts regarded as harmful to the public interest, but in contrast, other state commitments, notably those arising of the state social policies and social rights, lie outside this guarantee and are subject to instability. Well, and what about politics and law in the social reality of austerity? In my point of view, there are 4 elements. Firstly, it is because austerity, despite emerging on an economic model for combating the crisis, is orchestrating a profound legislative reform involving different areas of law associated with the functioning of the economy, in particular social and labor rights. However, in the Bible of public debate and the narrative based on the inevitability of the neoliberal model, the law is presumed to be politically neutral, and any discussion of its principles and bases are avoided. Thus, seems to me, austerity emerged as a source of a new positivism and legal formalisms. Secondly, in returning to the neoliberal rhetoric of the 80s and 90s, based on the cost and inflexibility of social and labor rights, austerity relocates the pressing need for reform of the social state or welfare state. Therefore, although in another context we are again encountering the theoretical debates we used to study as part of the recent history of the sociology of law concerning the level of autonomy that exists between politics, the law, and society. Thirdly, the austerity model corresponds to a questioning of the European social model, both in geopolitical terms and as a standard reference for political and economic development. This constitutes an interpolation of the theoretical and political developments of soft law, European legal pluralism, and its models of governance that have full reflection on the sociology of law. Fourthly, the austerity paradigm is constraining the patterns of social conflict leading to its transformation. Thus, austerity establishes itself as a new political and legal source for the structures of social conflict and litigation, interpolating the role of the courts, access to law and justice, and the individual and collective capacity to exercise rights. Of course, there are a lot of scenarios, and I try to put in action a research program about austerity society, about the law of austerity society, and I choose 2 scenarios to share with you, scenarios that could become paths to study, but I think also ways to make some kind of intervention in the public sphere. One scenario I called him blame as an element of legal awareness. It is from it is from this perspective that a socio-legal approach to blame and legal conscience associated with the austerity society can be tested. That means we recognize a kind of symbolical legal trade-off under the terms of which private civil liability is transformed into a rhetoric of criminalization of the freedom of the individuals expressed through their subjective rights with their irresponsible behavior now sanctioned and condemned. The symbolical legal dynamic of the collective awareness of guilt creates an ambiguous socio-legal space in which individuals, in addition to renegotiating mortgage and loans and making increased efforts to meet their commitments, are also constrained by wage cuts, fiscal reforms of dubious equity, and a regression in labor and social rights. In fact, the homo juridicus of austerity is the in-debt man, gradually stripped of the social rights with which we may aspire to a minimum level of socio-economic security. Fear and legitimacy is another scenario. I know this, the word fear is often used by Bauman's approach and the colleagues who reflect about liquid modernity and its law, but it is precisely in relation to this later point that I would argue that there are nuances, specificities into the relationship between fear, exception, and legitimation in the context of the austerity society. Fear, in the context of austerity, is an integral part of a political contractualism which forms the basis of a paradoxical regime of causality. This is the point I wish to emphasize, given that fear in the austerity society is affirmed as a mechanism for translating structural problems, public debt and financial bailouts into individual designs or individual biographies. It therefore constitutes a mechanism for legitimation, converting the narrative of austerity into the dominant political social model and ensuring total priority is given to the moral values of austerity neoliberalism. To finish my intervention, I would like to point that we live in a moment, in a difficult moment. Of course, austerity is not a global phenomenon. It's an European, in this moment, I suppose, essentially a European phenomenon. Of course, in the United States, we have some discussions about this. But anyway, the most problematic issue to me is the fact that we have now the exception became the rule and the normality. And we should not accept this. The exception is not, in this perspective, only a legal discussion or a political discussion. It is also a way of organizing society. So, I suppose we need, well, I will keep on doing the reflection in the impacts of the austerity society, because raising the reflection under this topic may touch collective thought and may help raising alternative solutions to austerity. Final remark. one thing I'm absolutely sure, and to quote José Regio's words, a Portuguese poet, I don't know exactly the way I'm going through. I don't know either what is the final way, but one thing I'm sure, I know I'm not going to follow the austerity solutions. Thank you.